Joe's childhood was a basically happy one. At the same time, it was steeped in financial hardship, as his Hungarian immigrant parents struggled to keep the family afloat in the United States during World War II. Joe's father, after a series of jobs as a laborer, ultimately scraped together enough money to start a small hardware store, which survived, but Joe had to quit school in the 9th grade to help run the business. He put in 9 years at the store before being drafted for the Vietnam War 23. When Joe returned from the Army, he took more of an interest in the store, and with some far-sighted marketing strategies, turned it into a successful enterprise that ultimately employed 6 full-time workers. Joe was proud of what he had accomplished, but harbored lifelong shame and regret over his shortened education, especially as he had been an outstanding student. The store was thus both the boon and the bane of his existence. Joe met Florence at age 45 after he took over the store from his father and established himself as a respectable neighborhood businessman. Before meeting Florence, the energetic businessman's social life was spare. His goal of making a success of himself was his overriding concern. As their relationship progressed, Joe revealed his lack of education to her, as though making a grave confession. Far from being repelled, Florence was all the more impressed with Joe's accomplishments. The couple married within a year. Joe and Florence worked hard, raised a daughter, saved what they earned, and eventually enjoyed the fruits of their labor in the form of a comfortable retirement when he was 70. The couple continued to live in the neighborhood where Joe grew up and had his business. They spent much of their time with friends. 6 years into Joe's retirement, when he was 76, Joe and Florence were returning from a Florida vacation when catastrophe struck. The catastrophe was not an airplane accident or anything like that. It was a more private event, not apparent to anyone but Joe. It had a profound and expanding effect on the retired veteran. After their plane took off from the airport and Joe settled back in his seat, he noticed that it was getting difficult to breathe. It felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the plane. As Joe's breathing became increasingly labored, he began staring at the plane's sealed door, contemplating the fresh air on the other side. Then, suddenly, he had another thought, which frightened him. He wondered if he might feel so deprived of oxygen that he would be tempted to make a mad dash for the door and open it in mid-flight. He struggled to banish this vision from his brain, but soon he became aware of his heart racing furiously in his chest cavity. The pounding became almost unbearable. He could feel every beat. The beating grew so strong that he thought he could actually hear it. Joe looked over at his wife, Florence, in the seat next to his. She was peacefully immersed in a magazine, oblivious to his condition. He stared at her, wondering what he must look like in such a state. His spouse glanced up for a moment, gave Joe the briefest of smiles, and went back to her reading. She obviously hadn't a clue as to what he was going through. Joe felt as if he were about to die or lose his mind. He couldn't tell which at this point, and she continued reading as if nothing were happening. Finally, Joe had to say something. He asked Florence if the air in the plane felt stuffy to her. She said it seemed fine, but suggested that her husband open the valve overhead if he felt uncomfortable. He did so and felt only slightly better. The rest of the plane ride was sheer torture. Joe spent the entire time trying to get the cool air to flow directly onto his face from the valve above. This activity sustained him until the plane landed. When the passengers were finally permitted to disembark, Joe couldn't get to the door fast enough. As he emerged from the plane, he felt released from a horrible confinement. After arriving home at his apartment in the city, the retired store owner felt better. He was still shaky, but he said nothing to Florence, who remained unaware of what had happened. Joe slept well that night, and by the next morning felt like his old self. He decided to put the whole episode behind him. Joe continued to feel fine for the next few days. Then one night he awoke at 2 a.m. in a cold sweat. His heart felt as though it were about to leap out of his chest. His lungs seemed incapable of drawing any oxygen from the air. His first thought was to open the bedroom window to make it easier for him to breathe. But as Joe got out of bed, he suddenly drew back in alarm. He recalled the airplane door and what had seemed like an almost uncontrollable urge to force it open in mid-flight. He wondered if this meant he had an unconscious desire to commit suicide. Joe concluded he should stay away from the window. Instead, he sat motionless on the edge of the bed, while his thoughts raced along with his heart toward some unreachable finish line. The man was frightened and confused. He was also gasping loudly enough to awaken Florence. She asked him what was wrong, and he told her his physical symptoms. He couldn't breathe, and his heart was pounding so hard that his chest ached. Florence immediately concluded that her husband was having a heart attack and called an ambulance. The ambulance workers arrived, administered oxygen, and rushed Joe to the emergency room. By the time the patient got there, however, he was feeling much better. A cardiologist examined him, performed a battery of tests, and eventually informed Joe that he had not had a heart attack. In fact, there was nothing obviously wrong with him. The doctor told Joe he could go home, that the episodes were probably just anxiety attacks. Joe felt relieved that his heart seemed to be okay, but was confused as to exactly what was wrong with him. He wanted nothing more than to forget the whole matter. However, as time passed, that became increasingly difficult. In fact, over the course of the next few weeks, he had 2 more attacks in the middle of the night. In both cases, he just lay in bed motionless, praying that the symptoms would go away. Then there was a new development. One morning, Joe was walking down a busy street in his neighborhood on a routine trip to the store when he was overcome by the same symptoms he had previously had at night. Out of the blue, his heart started pounding, his breathing became labored, and he felt dizzy. Also, he couldn't stop trembling. He looked around for a safe haven, a store or restaurant where he could sit down, but he felt as if he were in a kind of dream world. Everything around him, the people, the traffic, the stores, seemed unreal. He felt bombarded by sights and sounds and found it impossible to focus on anything. The overwhelmed man then recalled the cardiologist's mention of the term anxiety attack and came to the sickening realization that the doctor must have detected that he had mental problems. Joe feared that he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He was several blocks from home but discovered, to his relief, that he could make his way back to the apartment with less difficulty than he anticipated. Once inside, Joe sat down on the living room sofa and closed his eyes. He felt certain he was losing his mind. It was just a matter of time before the next attack sent him off the deep end. As he became caught up in his private terror, he heard a sound at the front door. It was Florence returning home from her shopping. Once again, Florence appeared to have no inkling that anything was amiss. She cheerfully related the details of her shopping trip, the neighbors she met at the store, the things she bought, and the like. Joe could barely follow what she was saying, further proof in his mind that he was rapidly losing his grip. Finally, his wife suggested that they go out for a walk. At this, Joe realized that the very thought of leaving the apartment was terrifying to him. What if he had an attack in the middle of the street and could no longer function, physically or mentally? He felt as if he had a time bomb inside him. In response to Florence's suggestion, he simply broke down in tears. Florence begged her husband to tell her what was wrong. Joe confessed that he had just had another one of his attacks, this time on the way to the store, and that this one was so bad he was forced to return home. Now he dreaded going outside. Florence could see that Joe was extremely upset, but at the same time she was puzzled. There didn't seem to be anything wrong with him. He was in no obvious physical pain, and he appeared vigorous and alert. She insisted they make an appointment with their primary care physician. In the week before the appointment, Joe made a few tentative forays onto the street in Florence's company. He felt some symptoms while outside, but did not have as intense an attack as he had that one time when he was alone. His nighttime episodes increased in frequency, however, to the point that he could count on waking up with an attack almost every time he went to bed. At the doctor's office, Joe recounted his repeated attacks of racing heart, breathlessness, and tremulousness. He didn't know quite how to describe his fear of losing his mind, nor did he really want to, so he left that part out. He did convey, however, that he had now become so apprehensive about the attacks that he was reluctant to venture outside for fear of being overwhelmed. In describing his symptoms, Joe noticed that he was actually starting to have some of them. As he continued, his physician became increasingly confident that the patient had. "What do you think the psychiatric diagnosis is?" Put it in the comments down below. Thank you so much for engaging. Please like and subscribe if you learned something and want to know more case studies.